You're listening to the man who melted her winter. Chapter 1. First Snow. The winter air bit sharply through the narrow streets of the small town, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of snow. Frost painted delicate patterns on the windows of the quaint shops that lined the cobblestone path, each storefront telling its own story through warm, glowing displays. Darcy pulled her black leather jacket tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out of her jewelry store, the Gothic sign above the door creaking softly in the wind. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as she paused to lock the ornate iron door handle. The blue highlights in her layered hair caught the pale afternoon light, contrasting sharply against the jet-black strands that framed her angular face. Her dark eyes, rimmed with precisely applied eyeliner, surveyed the street with the same calculated indifference she showed the world every day. Everything about her appearance was carefully curated to keep others at a safe distance, from her all-black ensemble to the way she carried herself with an air of untouchable confidence. Across the narrow street, the new bookstore had been open for exactly 3 months. Darcy had watched its owner, a pale, quiet man with the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen, arrange and rearrange his modest collection of books with meticulous care. She'd noticed him, of course, but had made no effort to acknowledge his presence or welcome him to the neighborhood. That wasn't her way. Julian had arrived in town when the leaves were just beginning to turn, carrying with him only a few boxes of personal belongings and an extensive collection of carefully preserved books. His albinism made him stand out in any crowd, but here in this small town, the stares seemed to follow him wherever he went. His hair was white as fresh snow, his skin pale as porcelain, but it was his eyes, those deep, ocean blue eyes that held a gentleness that seemed almost out of place in a world that had often been unkind to him. The bookstore he'd opened was small but meticulously organized. Cozy reading nooks were tucked between towering shelves, and soft lighting created an atmosphere of warmth and tranquility. Behind the shop, he'd made a simple home for himself, just a small room with the basics, but it was his sanctuary from the outside world's curious glances and whispered comments. On this particular afternoon, Julian was arranging a display of winter poetry collections near the front window when he heard the familiar sound of approaching footsteps. His muscles tensed instinctively as he recognized the voices. 3 local teenagers who had made it their mission to remind him daily that he didn't belong. "Hey, Snowflake," one of them jeered. "Still hiding in your book cave." Julian didn't respond. He'd learned silence offered the safest escape. Another boy picked up a small stone and tossed it at the window. It hit with a sharp crack, spidering the glass. Julian flinched. "Oops," the boy sneered. "Guess even the glass can't stand how creepy you are." From across the street, Darcy had been watching. Her expression was unreadable, but her jaw was tight. She didn't care for small talk or friendly smiles, but bullying, that was something she had no tolerance for. She stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" Her voice was cool and razor-sharp. The boys froze. The ringleader managed a week, just talking to the new guy. "Funny," Darcy said, crossing the street. It looked more like harassment. She stood between them and the window, arms crossed. Her presence was commanding. "And that window looks like property damage." The boys, suddenly uncertain, began to back away. "We were just messing around." "Try messing around somewhere else," she cut in. "If I see you near his shop again, we'll have a very different conversation. And you'll be paying for that window." They didn't argue. They turned and disappeared down the street. Julian had watched the entire exchange from behind his damaged window, his blue eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been gratitude. No one had ever stood up for him like that, certainly not a stranger, and definitely not someone who looked like they could handle themselves in any situation. Darcy turned to face the bookstore, her expression already returning to its usual mask of cool indifference. For a moment, their eyes met through the cracked glass, and Julian felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. He opened the door slowly, the small bell above it chiming softly in the quiet street. Standing in his doorway, he looked even more ethereal than usual, his white hair catching the light like spun silver. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost musical in its gentleness. "Thank you, you didn't have to do that." Darcy shrugged. "They were loud, disturbing my work." Julian's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "I'm Julian," he said, offering a hand. "I run the bookstore." Darcy looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, her instincts warring between the desire to maintain her distance and something else. Something softer that she didn't want to examine too closely. Finally, she reached out and shook his hand briefly, her black painted nails a stark contrast against his pale skin. "Darcy," she replied simply. "Nice to meet you," he said with a small smile. There was no judgment in his voice, no surprise at her appearance, just warmth. "You should get that window fixed," she said, already turning. "It'll get worse." "I will. Have a good evening, Darcy." The way he said her name made something flutter in her chest. She pushed it aside and walked away, boots tapping the cobblestones. Julian watched her go, his hand tingling from the brief contact. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him without pity or discomfort. There had been something fierce and unexpected in her defense, and something else he couldn't name. Later, as he swept glass from the floor, his thoughts kept returning to Darcy. Across the street, Darcy sat in her apartment above the shop, a mug of cold tea in her hands. She stared at the bookstore's warm light behind the temporary cardboard patch in the window. She told herself she'd stepped in because of the noise, that it was practical, nothing more. But her mind kept circling back to Julian's eyes, the softness in his voice, the way he'd said her name. "Don't be ridiculous," she muttered to herself, getting up to close the curtains. It was just the neighborly thing to do. She pushed the thought away and busied herself with her nightly routine. Tomorrow she'd go back to being who she always was, guarded, distant, composed. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the wind whistle through the narrow streets of the town, Darcy found herself thinking about blue eyes and gentle smiles, about the way Julian had looked at her as if he could see something in her that she had forgotten existed. Across the street, Julian was having similar thoughts as he settled into his own bed in the small room behind his bookstore. He had spent so many years learning to be invisible, to move through the world without drawing attention to himself or his differences. But today, for the first time in longer than he could remember, someone had seen him, really seen him, and had chosen to stand up for him. The winter wind continued to blow through the small town, carrying with it the promise of change and the whisper of possibilities yet to be discovered. Chapter 2. The Warmth of Simple Things. The next morning arrived with fresh snow that transformed the small town into something from a fairy tale. Darcy emerged from her apartment later than usual, having spent the night tossing and turning with thoughts of gentle blue eyes and soft-spoken gratitude that had somehow slipped past her carefully constructed defenses. Her morning routine was simple: a quick walk to the bakery for a sandwich and coffee, then straight to work. She didn't believe in lingering over breakfast. Such luxuries were for people who had time for sentimentality. Darcy had neither. With her ham and cheese sandwich tucked under her arm, she made her way back through the snowy streets when she noticed Julian standing outside his bookstore, sweeping snow from his steps. He looked even more ethereal in the morning light, his white hair catching the pale sunlight like spun silver. "Good morning, Darcy," Julian called out. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Darcy glanced around at the snow-covered street. "It's cold," she replied neutrally. Julian chuckled softly. "I suppose that's one way to look at it. Though I've always found there's something peaceful about the first snow. It makes everything seem quieter, more thoughtful." Despite herself, Darcy found her steps slowing. There was something about the way Julian spoke that made her want to understand what he saw that she apparently missed. "You're up early," she observed. "I wanted to make sure the walkway was clear," Julian explained. "Yesterday's incident reminded me to be more careful about maintaining the front of the shop." "Have they been back?" Darcy asked, concerned about the bullies. "No. I think your conversation with them was quite effective." Relief flickered through Darcy's chest, though she kept her expression neutral. An awkward silence settled between them until Julian surprised her with an unexpected question. "What's in the sandwich?" Darcy blinked, caught off guard. "Ham and cheese. It's adequate." Julian's smile widened. Adequate. That's quite the endorsement. There was no mockery in his tone, just gentle amusement, though I've always believed that even sustenance can be a little more enjoyable with the right approach. Before Darcy could respond, Julian continued. Actually, I was wondering if you might like to join me for lunch today. I made far too much soup yesterday evening, and it seems a shame to let it go to waste. The invitation hung in the air like a delicate snowflake. Darcy stared at him, her mind racing. Accept, and she would be stepping outside her careful boundaries. Decline, and she would seem rude. It's just lunch, Julian said gently. Between neighbors. And honestly, you'd be doing me a favor. I always cook too much when I'm nervous. The admission made Darcy feel less alone in her uncertainty. What kind of soup? Tomato basil, with fresh bread. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and filling. The idea of sitting down for an actual meal with someone else was so foreign to her routine that it felt almost dangerous. But there was something about Julian's gentle persistence that made it easier to consider. All right, she said quietly. What time? Noon. Just knock on the side door when you're ready. The morning passed slowly, with Darcy finding it difficult to concentrate on her Celtic rings. She kept glancing at the clock, watching it creep toward noon with anticipation and dread. At 11:50, she made her way to Julian's side door and knocked. It opened almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. He had changed into a soft gray sweater that made his blue eyes seem even more vivid. Perfect timing. Come in, please. Darcy stepped into a cozy living space that felt like an extension of the bookstore. Shelves lined the walls with well-read books. A small table was set for two, with simple white bowls and cloth napkins. The smell of tomato basil soup filled the air, rich and warming. This is nice, she said, surprised to find she meant it. Thank you. I know it's not much, but it's home. She noticed his careful movements as he ladled soup, the attention he paid to equal portions, the fresh bread he had made himself. You made the bread too? Julian nodded, blushing slightly. I enjoy baking. It's meditative, helps me think. They sat across from each other, and Darcy was struck by how intimate the small table felt. She took a spoonful of soup and nearly sighed at the rich, flavorful taste. This is, she began, then stopped. Adequate, Julian suggested with a gentle smile. Despite herself, Darcy felt her mouth twitch upward. Better than adequate. They ate in comfortable silence until Julian set down his spoon. Can I ask you something? Yesterday, when those boys were bothering me, you seem like someone who prefers to avoid confrontation. What made you decide to get involved? Darcy's chest tightened with discomfort. I don't like bullies, and 3 against 1 isn't fair odds. There's more to it than that, Julian observed quietly, isn't there? She met his gaze, startled by the understanding she saw there. Maybe, I know what it's like to feel alone against people who want to hurt you. The admission was more personal than anything she had shared in years. She immediately regretted it, feeling exposed and vulnerable. But Julian simply nodded as if he understood completely. Thank you. For yesterday, and for telling me that. The sincerity in his voice made something warm unfurl in Darcy's chest. I moved here hoping for a fresh start, Julian continued. Somewhere I could just exist without constantly feeling watched or judged. But it seems like some things follow you no matter where you go. People can be cruel, Darcy replied. Especially when they encounter something they don't understand. Yes, though I've found that kindness exists too. Sometimes in the most unexpected places. He was looking at her as he said this, and Darcy felt heat rise in her cheeks. The rest of the meal passed in easy conversation. When they finished, Darcy found herself helping with dishes without thinking about it. You don't need to do that, Julian protested. It's only fair. You cooked. As they worked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, Darcy was acutely aware of his presence, taller than she had realized. With quiet competence that was somehow comforting. I should get back, Darcy said finally, though she was reluctant to leave the warm, peaceful atmosphere. Of course. Thank you for joining me. It was nice to have company. As she put on her coat, Julian walked her to the door. In the small entryway, they stood closer than they had all afternoon. Darcy, Julian said as she reached for the handle. Would you like to do this again sometime? I mean, I cook too much most evenings, and it seems a shame to waste it. The invitation was offered hesitantly, as if he was prepared for rejection, but hopeful nonetheless. Darcy looked at his impossibly blue eyes and gentle smile that seemed to see something in her she had forgotten existed. Maybe, she said, which was as close to yes as she was capable of managing. Julian's smile brightened, transforming his entire face. I'll take maybe. As Darcy stepped back into the cold afternoon air, she carried with her the memory of warm soup and warmer conversation. For the first time in years, the prospect of tomorrow held something other than solitary routine. That evening, working late in her shop, Darcy found herself glancing frequently toward the warm light glowing from Julian's windows. She told herself it was just curiosity, but deep down, in a part of herself she rarely acknowledged, she knew it was something more, something that felt suspiciously like hope. Chapter 3: In the Safety of Pages. Julian had always believed bookstores were meant to be sanctuaries, quiet places where people could lose themselves in other worlds. His little shop had become exactly that for him, a refuge where he could exist, without constant awareness of curious stares or whispered comments about his unusual appearance. But in the week following his lunch with Darcy, Julian found himself looking forward to something unexpected: the sound of her footsteps on his doorstep. It had started 3 days after their shared meal, when Darcy appeared in his doorway during her afternoon break. She hadn't announced herself or offered explanation, simply stepped inside, nodded in his direction, and made her way to his art and fashion section. Julian watched from behind his counter as she moved through his space with purposeful grace. Her fingers traced book spines with surprising gentleness, lingering over volumes on Gothic architecture, Victorian morning jewelry, and alternative fashion movements. She selected a book on medieval metalworking techniques, and settled into the reading nook near the back window, where afternoon light filtered through glass with a soft golden glow. Julian continued his work, but found his attention constantly drifting to the figure curled in his reading chair. There was something almost magical about watching Darcy read. The sharp edges of her personality seemed to soften when absorbed in a book, her usual guardedness replaced by genuine curiosity. She would make soft sounds of interest, small unconscious reactions that made Julian's chest warm with an emotion he couldn't quite name. When she left that first afternoon, she simply returned the book to its shelf, nodded goodbye, and walked out without a word. Julian stood there afterward, feeling as though something significant had occurred. The next day she returned, and the day after that. Now, a week into this routine, Julian found himself unconsciously preparing for her arrival each afternoon, ensuring the reading nook was tidy, the light unblocked, the side table clear. He told himself these were good business practices, but deep down, he knew they were specifically for her. Today, as he heard her familiar footsteps, Julian felt the no familiar flutter of anticipation. He looked up to see Darcy stepping through his door, snowflakes clinging to her dark hair and black coat. "Afternoon," she said simply, though Julian noticed how her eyes immediately sought his face, as if checking to make sure he was there and well. "Good afternoon, Darcy. Cold out there today." She shrugged, unwinding her scarf. "It's winter." Julian smiled at her characteristically practical response. He had come to appreciate Darcy's directness, so different from the careful politeness most people used around him, afraid of saying the wrong thing about his appearance. Today she selected a book on Victorian morning jewelry and settled into what Julian had begun thinking of as her chair. The afternoon light fell across her face as she opened the book, softening her sharp features and making her look younger, more vulnerable. The kettle behind his counter began to whistle, and Julian prepared tea as had become his habit. He had noticed Darcy always arrived looking slightly tense, and chamomile tea seemed to help her settle into his shop's quiet atmosphere. He prepared 2 cups, honey in his, plain for hers. Appreciating the quiet domesticity of caring for someone in a small but meaningful way. "Tea?" he asked softly. Darcy looked up, her expression unguarded and curious. "Thank you," she said, accepting the cup with hands that brushed his briefly. The contact was fleeting, but Julian felt it like a small electric shock. Her skin was surprisingly soft, her fingers slender and strong. As Darcy returned to reading, Julian settled at his counter with inventory work. He was curious about what drew her to books on historical craftsmanship and Gothic aesthetics. Something more personal than mere professional interest seemed to guide her choices. He had begun noticing small details about Darcy that others probably missed. How her fingers unconsciously traced the Celtic knot on her choker when deep in thought, her careful precision with books, the way her sharp expression softened when genuinely interested. Julian was pulling a heavy art volume from his box when the inevitable happened. The book's corner caught, jerking free and causing a loose page to slice across his hand. "Ah," Julian hissed softly, seeing blood welling along the cut. Darcy looked up immediately, already setting aside her book and rising. "What happened?" "Just a paper cut, nothing serious." But Darcy was beside him, her hand gently taking his wrist to examine the wound. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, fingers cool against his skin. "It's deeper than it looks," she said with genuine concern. "You should clean it properly." Before Julian could protest, Darcy took charge with characteristic efficiency. She guided him to the small sink, turning on water and gently cleaning the cut with unexpected tenderness. Julian found himself mesmerized by her hands, the precise movements, how she unconsciously bit her lower lip in concentration, the unexpected gentleness in her touch. He couldn't remember the last time someone had cared for him with such focused attention. "Hold still," Darcy murmured, selecting a bandage and carefully applying it, her fingers lingering slightly longer than necessary. "There," she said, stepping back. Then, as if suddenly realizing what she'd done, her defensive mask slipped back. "You're too clumsy for someone who owns a bookstore," she muttered, though her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. "Thank you," Julian said gently, his voice carrying more warmth than the simple words suggested. "That was very kind of you." Darcy shrugged, moving back toward her chair. "It was just a bandage. Nothing special." But Julian could see the faint pink in her cheeks, how she avoided meeting his eyes. The moment had affected her too. The afternoon continued peacefully, but something had shifted between them, some invisible barrier lowered, allowing for new intimacy neither was ready to name. As closing time approached, Julian began his end-of-day routine while Darcy gathered her things. It was as they prepared to leave that they heard familiar voices, young, loud, and filled with cruel confidence that made Julian's stomach clench. Well, came the ringleader's voice from the previous week. "Look who's still here, playing with his little books." Julian froze in his doorway, key in hand. The three boys approached, their expressions suggesting they'd learned nothing from their previous encounter with Darcy. "Hey freak, we're talking to you." Julian's shoulders tensed with familiar anxiety, his mind racing through possible responses. What he hadn't expected was to feel a familiar presence suddenly beside him. Darcy appeared at his elbow as if from nowhere, her posture radiating dangerous confidence. She simply stood with arms crossed, dark eyes fixed on the approaching boys with an expression that could freeze water. The effect was immediate. The boys' swagger faltered as they recognized her, voices dropping to uncertain murmurs. "Oh," the ringleader said, bravado evaporating. We weren't." "You weren't what?" Darcy asked, her voice carrying that deadly quiet tone. "Because it looked like you were about to make the same mistake twice." The boys exchanged nervous glances, then turned and hurried away without another word, footsteps echoing as they disappeared into twilight. Julian stood in sudden silence, heart still pounding. He turned to Darcy, who watched their retreat with satisfaction. "Guess I have my own bodyguard now," Julian said softly, attempting gentle humor. Darcy turned to face him, and for a moment, Julian saw something vulnerable flicker across her expression before her mask returned. "Don't get used to it," she replied, but her voice lacked its usual bite. There was something almost fond in her tone that made his chest warm with affection. As they walked their separate ways, both carried memories of the afternoon's quiet intimacy, gentle caring hands, comfortable shared silence, unspoken understanding during both tender and protective moments. Julian lay in bed that night, thinking about Darcy's fingers against his skin as she tended his wound. The unexpected gentleness despite her usual armor. He thought about how she'd materialized beside him when trouble approached, ready to defend him as if protecting him had become natural as breathing. Something was growing between them, delicate, precious, and utterly unexpected. Julian had spent years believing his differences made him unworthy of genuine connection. But with Darcy, he was beginning to feel seen in a way that went beyond surface, appreciated for qualities having nothing to do with conventional beauty or social acceptance. As sleep claimed him, Julian's last thought was of dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul, and hands that had touched his with tenderness he'd never dared hope for. Tomorrow would bring another opportunity to exist in the same space as the mysterious woman, slowly, carefully beginning to trust him with glimpses of her true self. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Julian fell asleep with a smile, dreaming of quiet afternoons and pages turning in gentle light of his little sanctuary. Chapter 4: When Walls Crumble in the Dark. The winter wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying the promise of snow. Inside her jewelry shop, Darcy shivered despite the heater running at full blast. For 3 days now, she had been fighting off what felt like the flu, but her stubborn nature refused to let her close the shop. Her reflection in the black mirror showed what she didn't want to acknowledge. Her usually sharp blue highlights looked dull against pale skin, and her dark eyes had lost their typical fierce intensity. Even her signature black choker felt too tight around her fevered throat. Julian had noticed her condition during his morning visit. Through his bookstore window, he kept glancing over, watching as she moved sluggishly between customers. Her usual confident stride replaced by careful, measured steps. Around midday, Julian crossed the street with hot tea. "I brought you some tea," he said softly, his gentle voice carrying concern. "You don't look well." Darcy glanced up, movement slower than usual. "I'm fine," she replied, but her voice came out as a hoarse whisper rather than her typical sharp tone. Julian's blue eyes studied her face with quiet worry. "Your fever is making your cheeks flush. You should go rest." "I said I'm fine," Darcy repeated, turning back to her work with forced determination. But as she reached for another piece of jewelry, her hand trembled visibly. Julian wanted to say more, but knew better than to push. Instead, he simply left the tea on her counter. "I'll be across the street if you need anything." As the afternoon wore on, Darcy's condition worsened. The room spun whenever she stood too quickly, and the familiar weight of her silver rings felt impossibly heavy. By evening, she could barely keep her eyes open. When the last customer left, Darcy stumbled toward the door to lock up. Her fevered mind was foggy, and she forgot her usual careful routine. The lock didn't quite catch, leaving the door unsecured as she made her way to the narrow staircase. Her small attic apartment was her sanctuary, dark walls decorated with Gothic artwork, black curtains blocking out the world. But tonight, even this space felt foreign as fever clouded her thoughts. Darcy collapsed onto her bed without changing clothes, pulling a black blanket over her shivering form. Meanwhile, Julian had finished closing his bookstore and noticed that lights were still on in Darcy's shop, but something felt wrong. The door sin hadn't been flipped to closed, and through the window, he could see jewelry scattered as if someone had left mid-task. Julian knocked gently on the glass door. "Darcy, are you all right?" Silence answered him. When there was still no response, he tried the door handle and was surprised to find it unlocked. This was completely unlike the cautious woman he had come to know. "Darcy," Julian called as he stepped inside. He made his way through the shop, toward the back staircase. The door at the top was slightly ajar, and from beyond it came a sound that made his heart clench, quiet, distressed, sobbing. Julian climbed the stairs carefully and gently pushed open the door. What he saw nearly broke his heart. Darcy lay curled on her side, face flushed with fever, tears streaming down her cheeks though her eyes remained closed. She was trapped in what appeared to be a nightmare, her body trembling not just from illness, but from whatever demons haunted her dreams. "No, please," Darcy whispered in her sleep, voice thick with fear. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to break it. Please don't hit me." Julian's chest tightened as he realized she was reliving childhood trauma. Moving quietly, he approached the bed and placed the back of his pale hand against her forehead. She was burning up. "Darcy," Julian said softly, hoping to wake her from the nightmare. "Hey, it's okay, you're safe." But she remained trapped in her dreams, quiet sobs growing more desperate. "I'll be good, I promise. Please don't leave me alone in the dark. I'm scared." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. Without hesitation, he carefully sat on the edge of the bed and gently gathered her into his arms. She felt so small and fragile against his chest, nothing like the fierce, independent woman. She showed the world, "You're safe now. You're not alone. I'm here," Julian murmured, stroking her dark hair. His gentle voice seemed to reach her through the fog of fever and memory. Darcy's sobbing gradually quieted, though she remained unconscious, her body instinctively curling into the warmth and safety of his embrace. As the night deepened, Julian refused to leave her side. He found a damp cloth to cool her fevered brow and managed to make simple porridge from her sparse kitchen supplies. Every few minutes he would check on her, adjusting the cool cloth, making sure she was covered when chills struck, holding her gently when nightmares returned. "You're safe," Julian repeated softly each time she stirred restlessly. "I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone." Sometimes Darcy would mumble responses in her sleep, fragments that painted a picture of a childhood filled with fear and violence. Julian's heart ached for the little girl she had been, growing up without the love and protection every child deserved. Around 3 in the morning, Darcy's fever finally began to break. Her skin gradually cooled and her breathing became less labored. The nightmares seemed to retreat, leaving her in peaceful sleep. Julian remained vigilant beside her, dozing fitfully in a chair while keeping watch, ready to offer comfort if bad dreams returned. As dawn light began filtering through the dark curtains, Darcy's eyes slowly fluttered open. For a moment she looked confused, disoriented by the unfamiliar presence in her private space. "Julian," Darcy whispered, voice hoarse but clearer than the day before. "Hey," Julian said softly, leaning forward, his blue eyes filled with gentle concern. "How are you feeling?" Darcy tried to sit up, wincing as her body protested. The events of the night were hazy, fragments of fever dreams mixed with the sensation of safety she hadn't felt since childhood. "You stayed," Darcy said, wonder in her voice, as if the concept was foreign to her. "Of course I stayed," Julian replied, as if there had never been any other option. "You were really sick. I couldn't leave you alone like that." The simple statement hit Darcy with unexpected force. In all her years, no one had ever stayed to take care of her when she was sick. Even as a child, illness had meant isolation, being left alone to recover or not, with no one to bring water or simply sit with her so she wouldn't be afraid. Tears pricked at her eyes, but these were different from the fevered tears of the night before. These came from overwhelming gratitude and something else she was afraid to name. "I'm sorry," Darcy whispered, embarrassment coloring her pale cheeks. "You shouldn't have had to. I don't usually." "Hey," Julian interrupted gently, reaching out to touch her hand. "Don't apologize. Everyone gets sick sometimes. Everyone needs someone to take care of them." But Darcy shook her head, pulling her hand back. "Out of habit, not me. I take care of myself. I've always taken care of myself." The words were automatic, a mantra she had repeated for years, but saying them aloud after experiencing Julian's tenderness made them sound hollow. Julian studied her face, seeing the conflict there, ingrained independence warring with the very human need for connection and care. Maybe it's okay to let someone else take care of you sometimes. Maybe you don't always have to be strong. The suggestion was radical to Darcy's way of thinking. Strength and self-sufficiency had been her armor for so long that removing it felt terrifying. "I made you some porridge," Julian said, changing the subject to give her time to process. "You should try to eat something." As he helped her sit up and brought her the bowl of warm porridge, Darcy found herself studying his face. There were dark circles under his blue eyes, evidence that he had gotten little sleep while watching over her. "Why?" Darcy asked. Suddenly Julian paused. "Why what? Why did you stay? Why do you do all this?" It was a question that went to the heart of her deepest fears. In her experience, people only helped when they wanted something in return. Julian was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. Finally, he met her eyes directly, his expression completely open and honest. "Because you matter," Julian said simply. "Because when someone you care about is hurting, you don't just walk away. Because everyone deserves to have someone who will stay." The words settled into the quiet space between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge. Darcy felt something shift inside her chest, a wall carefully constructed over years, beginning to develop the tiniest crack. "Never," Darcy started, then stopped, unsure how to finish. Julian seemed to understand without her having to explain. "I know, but maybe that can change." As she slowly ate the porridge, Darcy allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine what it might be like to have someone who stayed through difficult times, who offered comfort without judgment. The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating. "Thank you," Darcy said quietly, and the words carried the weight of every kindness she had never received, every night she had faced alone. As Julian prepared to leave, Darcy felt a flutter of panic. The prospect of being alone again, after experiencing such profound care, felt suddenly unbearable. "Julian, could you, maybe stay just a little longer, until I fall asleep?" The request was perhaps the bravest thing she had ever said, an admission of need that went against every survival instinct she had developed. Julian's expression softened completely. "Of course, as long as you need." As Darcy closed her eyes and allowed herself to drift toward healing sleep, she felt something she had never experienced before. The complete security of knowing that someone was watching over her, that she was not alone with her vulnerabilities and fears. For Julian, watching her peaceful face as she slept, he realized that something fundamental had shifted between them during the night. The careful friendship they had been building had deepened into something more profound. Outside, snow began to fall softly on the quiet town. But inside the small attic apartment, warmth had finally found its way into two hearts that had been cold for far too long. Chapter 5: Running from What the Heart Knows. 3 days had passed since Julian cared for Darcy during her fever. Standing before her black mirror, adjusting her choker, Darcy's reflection showed the same fierce Gothic exterior as always. But her dark eyes betrayed inner turmoil she couldn't suppress. The memory of Julian's gentle touch, his whispered comfort, the overwhelming safety in his arms, it all haunted her, creating warmth in her chest she desperately wanted to ignore. "This is exactly what I swore I'd never become," Darcy muttered, gripping her counter until her knuckles turned white. Weak, dependent, like her. The image of her mother flashed through her mind, a woman destroyed by her need for a man who brought only pain. Darcy had built her identity around being different, strong enough to need no one. Across the street, Julian arranged books in his window, his blue eyes drifting toward her store with concern. He had noticed her change immediately, how she now avoided his gaze, tensed whenever he approached. When Julian entered with tea that morning, offering it with his characteristic gentle smile, Darcy forced neutrality into her voice. "I'm fine. I don't need anything. Are you sure?" "You seem," I said. "I'm fine," she interrupted sharply, immediately regretting the harshness but unable to soften it. Julian's expression remained patient, understanding. "Okay," he said quietly, placing the tea on her counter. "Anyway, I'll leave this here, just in case." This pattern continued for days, Julian offering small kindnesses, Darcy accepting with cool politeness, never cruel enough to drive him away, but never warm enough to encourage him. Julian, recognizing someone pulling back out of fear, continued his quiet acts of kindness without expectation, but Darcy grew increasingly agitated. The more kindness Julian showed, the more her defenses wanted to slam shut. She caught herself watching for him, listening for his door chime, and it terrified her. One afternoon, watching Julian stumble on ice through her window, Darcy's heart lurched with concern. She moved toward her door before catching herself. The involuntary reaction horrified her. This was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid. That evening she noticed Julian's bookstore lit well past closing time. Through his window, she could see him slumped over paperwork, exhaustion clear in his posture. "It's not your problem," Darcy told herself firmly. He can take care of himself. But she couldn't shake the image of Julian looking so tired and alone. She paced her apartment until midnight, when his lights finally went out. Realizing she'd been holding her breath, the next morning brought no sign of Julian. His usual visit didn't happen, and his bookstore remained dark well past opening time. At first, Darcy told herself she was relieved. This was what she wanted. But as morning progressed, cold worry knotted her stomach. By noon she was making excuses to step outside, stealing glances at his clothes shop. By mid-afternoon, worry had transformed into barely contained panic. What if he was sick? What if something had happened? The irony wasn't lost on her. She was experiencing exactly the concern she'd been trying to avoid. But now that it had taken hold, she couldn't shake it. As sunset approached and Julian's shop remained dark, Darcy could no longer pretend she had spent days trying to maintain emotional distance, but her fear for Julian's well-being made it clear. Her efforts had been futile. She was already in too deep. She already cared too much, standing in her shop, surrounded by Gothic jewelry that usually brought comfort. Darcy finally admitted the truth. She was falling in love with Julian, and no amount of self-protection could change that fact. The question was whether she was brave enough to act, or whether fear would cost her the most important connection she'd ever made. Snow began falling again, as Darcy made her decision. She couldn't live with not knowing if Julian was all right. Whatever the cost to her emotional walls, she had to find out. Grabbing her black coat, preparing to cross the street, Darcy realized that sometimes caring meant taking risks her mother had taken for the wrong person, but risks that might be worth taking for the right one. Julian was worth the risk. With that thought burning in her chest like a flame, Darcy stepped into the snowy evening, ready to face whatever lay across the street and whatever it might mean for the walls she'd spent years building around her heart. Chapter 6. When her winter melted. The snow fell in thick, silent sheets as Darcy stood frozen between their two shops, her breath coming in ragged clouds. The absence of light in Julian's windows felt like a physical weight pressing against her ribs. She had spent days building walls between them, only to realize now, with terrifying clarity, that her heart had long since crossed this street without her permission. Her gloved hands trembled as she pressed them against the frosted glass of his shop door. The darkened interior reflected back a distorted version of her own face. Pale, wide-eyed, the blue streaks in her hair, the only color in the winter gloom. He could be hurt. He could be lying unconscious. He could be. The thought slithered through her defenses like ice water. Before she could second-guess herself, she was moving toward the side entrance, her boots leaving deep imprints in the fresh snow. The door yielded with a groan that sounded too much like surrender. The scent of old paper and bergamot tea enveloped her as she stepped inside. The sitting room was bathed in the dying embers of a fire, casting long shadows that trembled against the walls. And there, Julian lay curled on the couch, his usually pristine white hair damp with sweat, his long fingers clutching a blanket like a lifeline. Even in sleep, his brow remained furrowed, as if his dreams offered no respite from whatever fever haunted him. Darcy's throat tightened. This was the man who had held her through her own nightmares, who had stayed when anyone else would have left. The man who looked at her as if she was something precious instead of broken. She knelt beside him, the floorboards creaking under her knees. When her fingers brushed his forehead, the heat radiating from his skin sent a jolt through her. "Julian," she whispered, her voice rough with unspoken fear. His eyelids fluttered open, those impossibly blue eyes focusing on her with dazed recognition. A weak smile touched his cracked lips. "Darcy." Just her name, but it sounded like a prayer. "You're burning up," she muttered, already reaching for the cloth she'd soaked in cool water. The practical motions grounded her, wringing out the fabric, folding it neatly, anything to avoid the way her hands wanted to shake. His fingers closed around her wrist with surprising strength. "You came." She refused to meet his gaze. "You would have done the same, but you didn't want me to." The words hung between them, heavy with all the times she'd turned away, all the kindnesses she'd refused. The damp cloth hovered in midair as Darcy finally looked at him. Really looked. The fever had painted his pale skin with splotches of red, his breathing shallow. Yet his eyes held that same quiet understanding that had unnerved her from the beginning. I was scared, she admitted, the confession torn from some deep, hidden place. Julian's thumb traced circles on her inner wrist. Of what? Of this. She gestured helplessly between them. Of needing someone, of being. Her voice broke. Of being like my mother. The memory rose unbidden, her mother's hollow eyes. The way she'd wasted away waiting for a man who'd never loved her enough to stay. Darcy had sworn never to let herself be that vulnerable, that weak, but Julian was shaking his head, his breath warm against her knuckles as he pressed a kiss to her clenched fingers. You're nothing like her, he murmured. You're the strongest person I've ever known. A sound escaped her, half laugh, half sob. Then why do I feel like I'm falling apart? Because you're finally letting someone catch you. The truth of it resonated through her like a struck bell. All these years, she'd mistaken solitude for strength, isolation for independence. But Julian had seen through her armor from the very beginning. Darcy, he said softly, do you remember a boy from when you were young? Pale, different. Bullies had cornered him in the snow. Her breath caught. Something flickered at the edge of her memory. The bite of winter air, the jeering voices of older kids. The sharp pain as a rock grazed her forehead. And those eyes, those impossible blue eyes staring up at her in wonder as she stood between him and his tormentors. Her fingers rose unconsciously to trace the faint scar near her hairline. That was you. Julian's smile held generations of tenderness. You bled for me that day. I tried to give you my last bandage, but you just wiped the blood away and told me to run home. His thumb brushed the scar now, reverent. No one had ever stood up for me before. Darcy's breath caught. All those childhood years believing no one saw her, no one cared, and this beautiful wounded boy had carried her memory like a talisman. You came back, she whispered. I never really left. His fingers laced through hers. Even when my family moved away, I thought of you. When I finally returned, I nearly collapsed when I saw your shop. I took the store across the street his voice dropped to a husky whisper, just to be near you again. Tears she hadn't authorized spilled down her cheeks. She had spent years building walls, convinced that love was weakness, that caring led only to pain. But Julian had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. You idiot, she whispered. But this time her voice cracked with something that sounded suspiciously like love. Julian reached up, his pale fingers brushing away her tears with infinite gentleness. I love you, Darcy. Even when you push me away. Even when you're terrified. I'm not going anywhere. The words shattered the last of her resistance. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his, her hands gripping his shoulders as if he might disappear. Don't you dare leave me, she whispered fiercely. Not now, not ever. Julian's breath warmed her lips. Never. And then, in the gentle glow of dying embers, with snow falling like blessing outside their sanctuary, he kissed her. It began soft, a question, a promise, a recognition. But when Darcy kissed him back, pouring years of loneliness and fear and desperate hope into the contact, it deepened into something transformative. His hands cradled her face as if she were precious, her fingers tangled in his silver hair, and, for the first time in her adult life, Darcy felt complete. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard, Julian rested his forehead against hers, his extraordinary eyes shining with joy and wonder. You found me, he murmured. Darcy smiled, a real, unguarded expression that transformed her entire face. You waited. Outside, the snow continued its quiet descent, blanketing their small town in pristine silence. But inside, two hearts that had been frozen by fear and circumstance, finally began to thaw, warmed by the recognition that sometimes the greatest courage isn't in building walls, but in daring to tear them down. Sometimes coming home means finding the person you've been looking for all along, even when you didn't know you were searching. Thank you for listening to this gentle love story. If it brought you a moment of warmth or peace, my heart is happy. Until we meet again, stay kind, stay soft, and keep believing in love. And remember, You deserve a love as deep and true as the one we just shared, because your heart, with all its beautiful imperfections, is meant to be cherished.